The first thing people noticed about the cabin was how small it looked. Nestled at the edge of a winding country road, surrounded by tall grass and old oak trees, the weathered wooden structure appeared almost forgotten by time. Its faded paint, simple porch, and rusted mailbox made it seem like the home of someone struggling to get by. Most people drove past without giving it a second glance. The owner of the cabin, a quiet man named Daniel Harper, preferred it that way. At 62 years old, Daniel had spent his entire life avoiding attention. He woke before sunrise, drank coffee on the porch, tended a modest vegetable garden, and spent his afternoons walking through the surrounding countryside. His clothes were plain, his pickup truck was nearly 20 years old, and nothing about his lifestyle suggested wealth. The locals assumed he was retired and barely making ends meet. Daniel never corrected them. Years earlier, after losing his wife to illness, he had left the city behind. The noise, pressure, and endless competition had become unbearable. He wanted peace, not prestige. What nobody knew was that Daniel's family had owned farmland in the region for over a century. His grandfather had purchased thousands of acres when land was cheap and farming communities were growing. Over generations, portions had been sold, leased, and inherited. By the time everything was settled, Daniel had become the sole owner of more than 400 acres surrounding the area. The land generated steady income through agricultural leases, renewable energy agreements, and conservation programs. Daniel never spoke about it. The cabin itself wasn't a financial necessity. It was a choice. It reminded him of simpler days. Unfortunately, not everyone respected simple living. The trouble began when construction started on the neighboring property. Massive trucks rolled down the road for weeks. Excavators cleared trees. Concrete mixers arrived before sunrise. Soon, a gigantic luxury home began rising on the hill overlooking Daniel's cabin. The owner was a businessman named Richard Coleman. Richard was the kind of man who measured success by visibility. Luxury cars, designer suits, private memberships, expensive watches. He wanted everyone around him to know exactly how successful he was. When his mansion was finally completed, it became impossible to ignore. The house sat on elevated ground with towering stone columns, a massive fountain, and windows that reflected sunlight across the valley. At night, decorative lighting illuminated the property like a resort. Richard loved showing it off. Guests arrived every weekend. Luxury vehicles lined the driveway. Loud parties echoed through the countryside. At first, Daniel paid little attention. People were free to live however they wanted. But Richard quickly became interested in the small cabin below. From his hilltop view, the modest structure looked out of place beside his new estate. Soon, comments started spreading through the community. Richard joked about the cabin whenever guests visited. He laughed about its appearance. He mocked the old truck parked outside. He referred to the property as an eyesore. People who wanted to impress Richard laughed along. The rumors eventually reached Daniel. He simply smiled and continued living his life. Years of experience had taught him that insecurity often disguised itself as arrogance. Still, Richard's behavior gradually became more aggressive. He began filing complaints with local officials. He claimed the cabin lowered surrounding property values. He argued that the area should be modernized. Several times, inspectors visited Daniel's property only to find everything perfectly legal and properly maintained. Each failed complaint seemed to frustrate Richard even more. He couldn't understand why the cabin remained untouched. In his mind, wealth should determine influence, and influence should determine outcomes. The situation escalated one afternoon when Richard hosted a large outdoor gathering. Business associates, investors, and local politicians attended. As guests toured the mansion grounds, many noticed the small cabin in the distance. Richard took the opportunity to entertain his audience. He pointed toward Daniel's property and openly ridiculed it. The group laughed. Several people snapped photos. Others joked that the cabin belonged in a museum. Daniel happened to be working in his garden when he noticed them. From across the field, he could see people pointing and laughing. The distance prevented him from hearing the words, but he understood the message. For a moment, sadness crossed his face. Not because of the mockery itself, but because so many adults found joy in humiliating someone they knew nothing about. Daniel returned to his gardening. The vegetables still needed watering. Life continued. Weeks later, Richard decided he wanted more. His property already dominated the hill, but he envisioned expanding it further. He planned to build guest houses, riding trails, and a private recreation area. The problem was location. Much of the land surrounding his mansion wasn't available for purchase. Or so he believed. One morning, he instructed a real estate consultant to identify ownership records for neighboring parcels. The results surprised him. Several large sections were owned by a single individual. The name listed repeatedly across maps and documents was Daniel Harper. At first, Richard assumed there had been some mistake. How could the owner of that tiny cabin control so much land? He ordered a deeper investigation. Days later, the findings arrived. Property boundaries stretched far beyond what anyone expected. Fields, forests, pastures, creeks, hundreds upon hundreds of acres. Nearly every direction surrounding Richard's estate connected back to Daniel. The discovery left him stunned. But instead of feeling embarrassed, Richard saw opportunity. If Daniel truly owned that much land, perhaps he could be persuaded to sell. Richard believed everyone had a price. And he believed money solved every problem. Confident as ever, he arranged a meeting. He expected a quick negotiation. A simple transaction. A signature on paper. What he didn't realize was that he was about to underestimate Daniel Harper for the last time. Because the quiet man in the little cabin wasn't just protecting a piece of property. He was protecting a family legacy. And when Richard finally learned the full truth about the land around him, the balance of power in the entire valley would change forever. The meeting was scheduled for the following week. Neither man knew it yet. But that conversation would become the beginning of a lesson that the entire community would never forget. And for Richard Coleman, it would mark the first step toward a humiliation far greater than any he had ever inflicted on others. The meeting took place on a cool Monday morning. Sunlight filtered through the oak trees surrounding Daniel Harper's cabin as a sleek black luxury SUV slowly rolled down the gravel road. Dust rose behind it before settling back onto the earth. Inside sat Richard Coleman. Accustomed to boardrooms, negotiations, and million-dollar deals, Richard approached the meeting with complete confidence. He had spent his entire career convincing people to sell, surrender, compromise, or cooperate. In his mind, Daniel Harper was simply another transaction waiting to happen. The difference was that Richard had never encountered someone like Daniel before. Daniel stood on his porch when the SUV arrived. Dressed in faded jeans and a simple work shirt, he looked exactly as he always did. Calm, unhurried, comfortable. Richard stepped out wearing an expensive tailored suit despite the rural setting. His polished shoes sank slightly into the gravel. The contrast between the two men could not have been more obvious. One looked wealthy. The other looked ordinary. Appearances, however, were often misleading. After a brief greeting, the two men sat on the porch overlooking the fields stretching toward the horizon. Richard quickly got to the point. He outlined his plans for expansion. He described luxury guest facilities, horse trails, private recreational areas, future development opportunities. According to Richard, the valley was on the verge of becoming a high-end destination. Then came the proposal, Richard offered to purchase several hundred acres surrounding his estate. The number he quoted would have impressed most people. It was far beyond market value, far beyond what many farmers could earn in years. Richard expected surprise. He expected excitement, perhaps even gratitude. Instead, Daniel listened quietly. When Richard finished speaking, Daniel looked across the fields for several moments before responding. The answer was simple. No. Richard assumed he had misunderstood. He repeated the offer. This time he increased the amount substantially. The answer remained unchanged. No. For the first time, irritation appeared on Richard's face. Very few people rejected offers of that size. Even fewer did so without hesitation. Daniel explained that the land was not for sale. Not now. Not later. Not at any price. Those acres represented generations of family history. His grandfather had worked them. His father had protected them. His wife had walked those fields beside him for decades. Every tree, stream, and pasture carried memories that money could never replace. Richard listened, but failed to understand. To him, land was an asset, an investment, a number on paper. The emotional value Daniel described seemed irrational. The meeting ended politely, but tension lingered beneath the surface. Richard returned home frustrated. He was accustomed to getting what he wanted. Rejection felt unfamiliar. Worse, it felt personal. Over the following weeks, Richard became increasingly obsessed with acquiring the surrounding land. His consultants explored alternate approaches. Developers were contacted. Lawyers reviewed zoning regulations. Surveyors studied property boundaries. Every path led to the same obstacle. Daniel Harper. The more Richard investigated, the more shocking the reality became. Daniel's ownership extended far beyond 400 acres. Additional parcels were controlled through trusts, conservation agreements, and long-term family holdings. The network of land surrounding the valley formed an invisible shield. Richard's mansion sat near the center. Daniel's properties surrounded him from nearly every direction. It was a fact Richard found deeply humiliating. For years, he had viewed Daniel as a poor neighbor living in an outdated cabin. Now he discovered that his modest neighbor possessed far greater wealth than most people in the county. Yet Daniel showed none of it. No luxury cars. No extravagant house. No displays of status. The discovery disturbed Richard more than he cared to admit, because it challenged everything he believed about success. Meanwhile, word began spreading throughout the community. Property records were public. Local residents slowly learned the truth. Farmers who had known Daniel for decades weren't surprised. They had always respected him. Others were stunned. The man they assumed struggled financially actually controlled one of the largest private land holdings in the region. The revelation changed how people viewed him. Some felt embarrassed for previously judging him. Others admired his humility. A few simply couldn't believe it. Richard hated every minute of it. Instead of becoming the valley's most influential figure, he now found himself overshadowed by the very man he had mocked. The attention only fueled his resentment. Soon, new problems emerged. Richard began receiving notices regarding future development restrictions. Several proposed projects required access through neighboring land owned by Daniel. Other plans required environmental approvals connected to conservation agreements. Agreements established decades earlier by Daniel's family. The mansion that once symbolized unlimited possibility suddenly felt confined. Every expansion plan encountered barriers. Every solution pointed back toward Daniel. Richard's frustration grew into anger. Rather than accepting reality, he blamed Daniel. He convinced himself that the older man was intentionally standing in his way. In truth, Daniel was doing nothing at all. He simply continued living his quiet life. He maintained trails, visited tenants, monitored conservation projects, and enjoyed peaceful evenings on his porch. But peace became increasingly difficult as Richard searched for new ways to pressure him. Small disputes began appearing. Boundary complaints, access disagreements, legal letters, survey challenges. Most were baseless. All consumed time and money. Daniel rarely responded emotionally. Years of life experience had taught him patience. Still, those closest to him noticed the strain. The conflict wasn't hurting him financially. It was disturbing the tranquility he had worked so hard to create. One evening, while walking across a hillside overlooking the valley, Daniel stopped beside an old oak tree planted by his grandfather nearly 80 years earlier. The view stretched for miles. Fields glowed beneath the setting sun. Wildlife moved through distant grasslands. The stream winding through the property reflected gold and orange light. Looking across the landscape, Daniel realized something important. The land wasn't merely an inheritance. It was a responsibility. Future generations deserved the same beauty and freedom his family had preserved. Allowing unchecked development would destroy much of what made the valley special. For the first time since Richard arrived, Daniel began considering long-term protection measures. Conservation expansion, permanent land preservation, additional legal safeguards. If implemented, such actions would make future development nearly impossible. The idea remained only a thought. For now. But circumstances were about to force his hand. Because Richard had grown desperate. And desperate people often make reckless decisions. Several weeks later, construction crews unexpectedly appeared near a disputed property line. Heavy equipment arrived without warning. Markers were moved. Trees were cleared. And by the time Daniel learned what was happening, damage had already begun. The incident would trigger an investigation. That investigation would uncover facts Richard desperately wanted hidden. And before it was over, the entire community would witness a spectacular collapse of reputation, influence, and pride. The battle over the land was no longer about expansion. It had become a battle over character. And karma was quietly preparing its next move. The damage was impossible to ignore. When Daniel Harper arrived at the disputed section of property, the sight before him felt like a punch to the chest. Several mature trees had been cut down. Deep tire tracks scarred the earth. Construction markers had been moved. Part of a natural wildlife corridor that had existed for decades had been disturbed by heavy machinery. For most people, it might have looked like a minor land-clearing project. For Daniel, it represented something far more serious. Those trees had stood longer than Richard Coleman had been alive. They had survived storms, droughts, floods, and generations of change. Now they lay scattered across the ground because someone had decided property lines were merely obstacles. Daniel did not react with anger. He reacted with determination. Years earlier, he might have confronted Richard directly. But experience had taught him that facts carried more weight than emotions. Instead of making accusations, he contacted licensed surveyors, environmental specialists, and local authorities. He wanted documentation, evidence, truth. Within days, professionals began examining the area. Property records were reviewed. Boundary markers were measured. Historical maps were compared. Drone imagery was analyzed. The results were alarming. The clearing operation had crossed onto Daniel's property. Not by inches, not by accident, by a significant margin. Multiple protected trees had been removed. Sensitive environmental zones had been disturbed. Several activities appeared to violate local regulations. What initially seemed like a small dispute was becoming a major issue. Word spread quickly throughout the valley. People who had followed the ongoing tension between Daniel and Richard became increasingly interested. Many residents had watched Richard's behavior for months. Some had privately questioned his attitude. Others had simply stayed silent. Now they were paying close attention. Meanwhile, Richard remained confident. He believed the issue would disappear. Money and influence had solved problems for him before. He assumed this situation would be no different. His attorneys immediately challenged the findings. Consultants were hired. Statements were issued. Responsibility was shifted toward contractors and subcontractors. Every possible explanation surfaced, except the simplest one. Someone had crossed a property line they had no right to cross. As investigations continued, something unexpected happened. Authorities began looking beyond the recent clearing project. Permit applications, construction approvals, environmental impact reports, contractor records. The deeper investigators looked, the more questions emerged. Small inconsistencies appeared, then larger ones. Documents didn't always match physical conditions. Certain modifications seemed to have occurred without proper authorization. Some improvements extended beyond approved boundaries. None of these issues alone guaranteed serious consequences. Together, however, they painted an uncomfortable picture. Richard's empire was not as flawless as it appeared. For years, people had admired the mansion on the hill. Now many wondered how much of it had been built through shortcuts. The attention intensified when local reporters began covering the story. The image of a wealthy businessman battling a quiet cabin owner captured public interest. But as more information became available, public sympathy shifted dramatically. People expected arrogance from powerful individuals. What surprised them was Daniel's response. He never celebrated the investigation. He never mocked Richard. He never sought attention. Whenever reporters attempted to interview him, he remained respectful and restrained. He simply stated that property rights applied equally to everyone. Rich or poor, powerful or powerless. Those words resonated with people, because many had experienced situations where influence seemed to outweigh fairness. Daniel became an unlikely symbol of accountability. Richard became a symbol of entitlement. The contrast grew sharper every week. As pressure mounted, Richard's social circle began changing. Friends who once attended his lavish gatherings became less visible. Business associates returned fewer calls. Some investors quietly distanced themselves. The confidence Richard projected publicly no longer matched the reality unfolding behind closed doors. Financial concerns were also emerging. Legal expenses increased. Project delays multiplied. Expansion plans stalled completely. Properties that once seemed destined to appreciate rapidly now faced uncertainty. The mansion remained impressive, but it had become a very expensive monument to frustration. One afternoon, Daniel received a visit from several neighboring farmers. Many had known his family for decades. Some had leased portions of his land for years. Others simply respected him. The visit wasn't about business. It was about gratitude. They thanked him for protecting the valley from reckless development. Several shared concerns they had been afraid to express publicly. They worried about rising land prices, loss of farmland, environmental damage, the disappearance of community values. For the first time, Daniel realized the conflict extended far beyond himself. People viewed the situation as a choice between two futures. One focused entirely on profit. The other balanced progress with responsibility. That realization strengthened his resolve. Meanwhile, investigators delivered another devastating blow. Evidence suggested that certain construction activities near Richard's estate had affected protected drainage systems connected to regional waterways. The issue attracted state-level attention. Experts became involved. Additional reviews were ordered. Potential penalties increased dramatically. Richard's frustration transformed into panic. The situation was no longer about acquiring land. It was about protecting everything he had built. Desperate to regain control, he launched a public relations campaign. Articles praised his investments. Statements emphasized economic benefits. Supporters highlighted charitable donations and local spending. But the effort failed to change public perception. People had watched his actions for too long. The narrative no longer belonged to him. Then came the moment that changed everything. At a county planning meeting attended by residents, officials, business owners, and community leaders, investigators presented preliminary findings. The room remained silent as maps, photographs, and records appeared on large screens. Evidence was organized carefully. Timelines were established. Boundary violations were documented. Environmental impacts were explained. No dramatic accusations were necessary. The facts spoke for themselves. Many attendees glanced toward Richard. Others looked at Daniel. The contrast could not have been clearer. One man had spent months trying to diminish another. Now the entire community understood who had truly respected the land. The meeting ended without final rulings. Those would come later. But public opinion had already shifted. Completely. Richard left the building facing cameras, questions, and growing criticism. Daniel left quietly through a side entrance. As always, he avoided attention. Yet something important had changed. People no longer saw him as the owner of a small cabin. They saw him as a man who had remained humble despite immense wealth. A man who had protected his family's legacy. A man who had refused to abuse power. That reputation proved more valuable than any mansion. Still, the story wasn't over. Not even close. Because investigators were finalizing their reports. Financial penalties were being calculated. Legal consequences were approaching. And Richard Coleman was about to discover that losing public respect was only the beginning. The greatest lesson karma had prepared for him was still ahead. A lesson that would force him to confront the very values he had ignored his entire life. And when that final chapter unfolded, the valley would witness a transformation no one expected. The final reports arrived 3 months later. By then, nearly everyone in the valley knew the story. What had begun as a wealthy man's attempt to expand his estate had evolved into a lesson about pride, character, and consequences. The official findings confirmed what investigators had suspected. Property boundaries had been crossed. Protected environmental areas had been disturbed. Unauthorized modifications had occurred during various stages of development. Multiple violations carried significant penalties. Some required costly restoration efforts. Others resulted in fines that reached into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. For Richard Coleman, the financial impact was painful. But the monetary losses were not what hurt most. The real damage was something money could not easily repair. His reputation. For years, Richard had carefully built an image of success. He wanted admiration, respect, influence, status. Now those same things were slipping away. Business associates who once sought his approval kept their distance. Investors became cautious. Partnership opportunities disappeared. People who had laughed at his jokes and attended his extravagant gatherings suddenly seemed unavailable. The support he once assumed was loyalty revealed itself as convenience. When success faded, so did many of the people surrounding him. The realization was difficult to accept. For the first time in many years, Richard found himself alone. Meanwhile, life at Daniel Harper's cabin remained remarkably unchanged. The garden still needed tending. The porch still welcomed quiet mornings. The field still stretched across the horizon. Daniel continued living exactly as he always had. The attention surrounding the investigation never interested him. He had not fought Richard to prove a point. He had fought to protect something valuable. The land. The community. His family's legacy. Nothing more. As summer approached, restoration work began across the damaged sections of property. Environmental specialists developed recovery plans. Native trees were replanted. Wildlife corridors were restored. Erosion control systems were installed. The process would take years to fully heal the affected areas. Nature always required patience. Daniel understood that. What surprised many people was his willingness to cooperate. Despite everything Richard had done, Daniel never attempted revenge. He never sought additional punishment. He never used his influence to make the situation worse. Whenever officials requested input, Daniel focused only on repairing the damage. His goal remained the same as it had always been. Protect the land. Move forward. The contrast between the two men became impossible for the community to ignore. One had spent months trying to dominate others. The other spent months trying to restore what had been lost. As public respect for Daniel continued growing, local leaders began approaching him about long-term conservation efforts. Several organizations proposed partnerships. Environmental groups expressed interest in protecting additional acreage. Community members supported preserving open spaces for future generations. After careful consideration, Daniel made a decision. One that would surprise everyone. He announced plans to place a substantial portion of his land under permanent conservation protection. Thousands of future development opportunities would disappear overnight. The preserved acreage would remain farmland, forest, wildlife habitat, and open space for generations to come. The announcement received overwhelming support. Farmers celebrated. Conservation advocates applauded. Families appreciated the commitment to preserving the valley's character. The decision also carried another consequence. Any remaining hopes Richard had for major expansion vanished immediately. The surrounding landscape would never become the luxury development corridor he had envisioned. The valley would remain exactly what Daniel's family had worked to protect for more than a century. At first, Richard viewed the announcement as another defeat. Another obstacle. Another reminder that he had lost. But something unexpected had begun happening inside him. Months of setbacks had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths. For years, he had measured worth through possessions. Bigger houses. More money. Greater visibility. Higher status. Yet despite acquiring all those things, genuine satisfaction always seemed temporary. There was always another goal. Another purchase. Another comparison. Another competition. Watching Daniel challenged everything Richard believed. The older man possessed enormous wealth, but lived without needing constant recognition. He commanded respect without demanding it. He influenced others without controlling them. The qualities people admired most about Daniel had nothing to do with money. That realization lingered, then grew, then became impossible to ignore. One evening near the end of summer, Richard found himself standing alone on the terrace of his mansion. The sun was setting beyond the valley. Golden light covered the fields. Shadows stretched across the hills. In the distance, he could see Daniel's cabin. Small, simple, peaceful. Months earlier, he had laughed at that cabin. He had considered it a symbol of failure. Now he saw something entirely different. Freedom, contentment, perspective. things he had spent years chasing without ever finding. For a long time, Richard remained silent, reflecting, regretting, learning. Several days later, he did something few people expected. He drove down the gravel road to Daniel's cabin. There were no reporters, no lawyers, no consultants, no audience, only two men and the truth. The conversation that followed remained private. No one ever learned exactly what was said. But neighbors noticed something afterward. The hostility disappeared. The complaints stopped. The legal threats ended. The tension that had consumed the valley for more than a year finally faded away. Life moved forward. Months turned into seasons. Seasons turned into years. The restored land gradually healed. Young trees began growing where damaged areas once stood. Wildlife returned. Streams flowed cleanly through protected habitats. The valley recovered. And so did the people living within it. Richard never became Daniel's closest friend. Some wounds take time to fully disappear. But he became something else. A better neighbor. A more thoughtful landowner. A humbler man. The transformation was not dramatic. It was gradual. Real change often is. As for Daniel, he continued living in the same cabin. Visitors occasionally expressed surprise when they learned who owned the vast landscape surrounding them. Some expected a mansion. Others expected luxury. Instead, they found a simple home occupied by a man who understood a lesson many people spend their entire lives learning. True wealth is not measured by what people see. It is measured by what remains when appearances no longer matter. The cabin never changed. The land remained protected. The valley endured. And the story became one local family's shared for years, whenever conversations turned toward pride, judgment, and karma. Because everyone eventually remembered the same lesson. The man who looked poor was richer than anyone imagined. The man who looked powerful was weaker than he realized. And the moment that changed everything was not when the truth about the 400 acres was revealed. It was when character proved more valuable than ownership. In the end, Daniel did not win because he had more land. He won because he never allowed wealth to define who he was. And Richard lost not because of fines, investigations, or public embarrassment. He lost because arrogance blinded him to the value of humility. Only when he finally understood that truth did karma complete its work. And only then did both men find peace. The end.